Real quick, I'd like to talk about my two favorite insects, one of which is shown here, and this is the Asian longhorn beetle. It was first discovered around 1996 in the New York area. It's thought that they were actually transported in untreated crates. They are, in fact, boring insects, so their larvae will do a lot of damage within usually ornamental trees. However, it could be devastating if they were found in forested areas to native and susceptible trees.
The first species I'd like to talk about is the fly Laphria, which is a type of robber fly. And these robber flies, as you can see, are really incredible mimics of bumblebees. Now, this is beneficial for several reasons. First of all, they look like a bumblebee, so a lot of predators might leave them alone, assuming they can sting. But the other thing is they like to feed on various flying insects, including bumblebees. And what they'll do is they'll typically sit on their favorite perch and watch things fly by. And then once they see something that they like, they figure out how fast it's going, where it's going, and they intercept it. They grab it with their legs and body slam it to the ground, jab in this great big beak, and inject it with this paralyzing saliva that liquefies the body contents, and then they can slurp it up like a big milkshake. Also, the Laphria species that we have here are often quite habitat specific, so certain species require really specific microhabitats, and they can often be an indicator of potential habitat health.
One of my favorite insects in this collection. As an ant biologist, of course, it's an ant. And these are leafcutter ants from the genus Atta. Now, these are the ants that you've either seen yourself in Central and South America, or maybe you've seen videos of them carrying parasols of leaves through the forest. Now, what's really interesting about these ants is they actually don't eat the leaves. So although they climb up to the tree and carefully cut down bits and carry it back to their nest, what they're doing is actually using it as the substrate to grow their own food. So when they take that leaf bit back to their nest, they grind it up into a little mulch, and they actually grow a fungus on that leaf bit. So they actually grow a mushroom farm, and that's their primary source of food. So in fact, they're among the world's first farmers. They've been farming their own food for about 50 million years.
Another insect that I really enjoy talking about is the spotted lanternfly. I imagine you have all heard of this, as it's been in the news pretty recently. The spotted lanternfly is, despite its name, it's a free-living hemipteran. And it does the most damage because it can go to a variety of trees and feed on them. In addition to the feeding damage, it emits this sticky, sweet honeydew. And the honeydew actually attracts sooty mold, which can be damaging, and it could affect the photosynthesis of the trees.
Another group of insects that I find really interesting actually are a group of butterflies that you see here. And what makes them so interesting is two things. One of which, they have an amazingly rich distribution. It goes across all of sort of the whole Arctic region, across the Bering Strait and down into the US and even into South America. Now, that's not the only thing that makes them exciting. These were actually collected by Vladimir Nabokov when he was a professor here at Cornell. Although most people know him from his literature and his novels, he actually was a well-established lepidopterist, so he studied butterflies. He published papers on them, and he actually made massive collections of them, and we have a large amount of his collection right here at Cornell University. Now, what I find most striking is in 1945, just because he'd been looking at these butterflies for so long and collecting them, he came up with a hypothesis for how he actually expected that they might have spread historically, sort of in deep evolutionary time. And he had come up with this idea that he thought they sort of originated in Europe, spread across the Bering Strait into North America, and eventually down to South America. But of course, at that time, he didn't have a real way to test that hypothesis. So several years ago, some colleagues of mine actually tested that hypothesis using DNA. And what they found was almost everything he had predicted was in fact true. So I think this is a really amazing collection, both because of the sort of celebrity status of the person that collected it, but also that he could come up with these really amazingly rich hypotheses for the evolution of the group, and actually most of it bore true.
This is a drawer of tiny moths called Nepticulidae, the minute eye-cap moths, so called because the base of the antenna has this great big swelling that actually pops over and covers the eye when they're at rest. I like to talk about these for several reasons. First of all, they illustrate partially why insects are so successful, because they can be very small. These are some of the smallest moths in the world, and as you can see here, they don't get much smaller than this. Because they're so small, they can live in very specific microhabitats. So most of these species, as a larva, spends their entire larval life in between the upper and lower layer of a single leaf, and create these really characteristic mines called the leaf mine. Some of them will produce plant swellings called galls, and this species in particular is quite interesting. It's one called Ectodemia castani, and I quite like this because this is one of the very few specimens that we know of this species. The reason for this is that it's probably long extinct. It was a gall maker on American chestnut, which was a very widespread tree across eastern North America, and the galls of this species were on young twigs and were very easy to find. However, we introduced chestnut blight back at the start of the 1900s, which wiped out American chestnut and also a whole bunch of different insects that depend on that tree species. So in many cases, we are the best record for species that are long gone.